everybody. Welcome back to the Convo Couch. I am Fiorella Isabel, and I'm here with Mike McCabe. He was a former candidate for governor in 2018, and he's the executive director of Our Revolution. Thank you, Mike, for coming in. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And as you know, we'll get right to it. Breaking news: Wisconsin postpones the primary until June. However, it's not that simple. There are a lot of things that play, which is why I brought you on here. I wanted to kind of break it down, dive deep into exactly what is going on, because people are hearing that it is, but that the state legislators are opposing it, and that there's like a battle going on right now. And it's such an important battle because not only are we fighting for the legitimacy of our elections and our democracy, but we are also fighting for the lives of human beings that we know will be greatly affected if this primary were to happen tomorrow. So, as far as I know, Milwaukee officials have issued an executive order today, and the order declares all municipal in-person polling places not open and must remain closed until election day, which is tomorrow. Can you tell me more about what's going on right now?
The election's supposed to be tomorrow,
Yeah.
and yet we have just today the governor issuing an executive order postponing the election, saying that it shouldn't happen until June. Republican leaders in the legislature, and Wisconsin's legislature is controlled, both houses are controlled by Republicans. They immediately went to the state Supreme Court, which has a conservative majority, and said, we want you to block the governor's order. We want an immediate injunction preventing that order from going into effect. And it'll probably be well into the night before we get a decision from the court. The irony is that the Supreme Court is banning oral arguments. They don't want any attorneys actually before them arguing cases because they're afraid of getting sick. They're afraid of the coronavirus as is everybody else. And so the lawyers are just throwing written briefs back and forth at the court. The court will make a decision sometime tonight. If the court stands with the legislative Republicans and says the governor's order is blocked and the election should go forward tomorrow, then there's a federal court case that will come back into play. And so, literally we're at the eve of the election, and we may not have an answer from the courts until into the wee hours of tomorrow morning. The local communities are not remotely ready to actually have in-person voting. You mentioned Milwaukee.
Yes.
Milwaukee normally has 180 polling locations throughout the city, and they've got 5 identified for, and they weren't even sure up until just recent days what those 5 locations would be, because they didn't know where they could staff locations. They don't have enough poll workers to staff polling locations, so they weren't even able to tell voters well in advance where the voters should show up if they wanted to do in-person voting. It's an absolute disaster. It's obviously a public health hazard, but also an incredible hazard to democracy. In the 2016 presidential primary in Wisconsin, over 2 million votes were cast. So far, a little bit over 1 million people have requested absentee ballots to be sent to them so that they can vote by mail. And people are not going to show up at polling locations. And imagine if you have 180 polling locations in a normal election in Milwaukee, you try to concentrate that to 5 and expect people to congregate in those places in the midst of a pandemic. This is insane.
It is insane.
What is being forced down the throats of people. And for weeks we've been asking the legislature to postpone the election. Then they made it obvious that they weren't going to do that. So we, for weeks now, have been asking the governor to call them into special session. He did that. They refused to convene in special session. So we went back to the governor and said, look, issue an executive order, use the emergency powers that you have under the state constitution and state law, and block the election. And it wasn't until today that he was willing to do that. So here we are, like I said, on the eve of the election, and it's absolute chaos, and people's lives are at stake here.
Exactly.
Poll workers should not be required to report to work. Voters should not be congregating at polling locations. Wisconsin is under a stay-at-home order,
Yeah.
and because of the coronavirus, and yet these elected officials think that people should go en masse and show up at polling locations tomorrow and vote.
Well, it's an obvious contradiction, and I just so about the governor though, couldn't he have done this a little bit earlier?
Of course.
It just seems like he was holding off in coalition with the state legislature, and it just seems like this is kind of like grandstanding now, like, oh yeah, like now I'm gonna do something about it, but really, where was the fight before, right?
For
Like,
the
where
long,
was it?
for the longest time, his position was that we can let the election go forward, that we can have it on April 7th. And I think the chorus of voices ended up becoming so overwhelming, saying, this is dangerous. You're putting people's lives in danger. We're right now in Wisconsin just hitting the peak of the coronavirus infections, and this is the worst possible time to tell people who've been most of the state, as everywhere else, people have been pretty good about staying at home, working
Yeah,
from home, not not going out into public places, and when people have been uh, they've been following the rules and they've been obeying these directives, and then they get this horribly mixed message that, oh, no problem, we can still have the election. We started pressing weeks and weeks ago for the legislature and governor to do the right thing,
yeah,
in on behalf of public health and also on behalf of democracy. For the longest time, they all refused. The governor had a change of heart in the 11th hour, did call for a special session last Friday. He announced that the legislature should come into special session on Saturday,
yeah.
just over the weekend. They refused, and so just today he issued the executive order that we've been asking him to issue for quite some time now.
So, well, here's a question I have though. If Milwaukee, for instance, says, "Hey, we issued this order. We will not have the municipal in-person places opened that day." It's the largest county in all of Wisconsin. So if these people don't get to vote, wouldn't that invalidate any sort of voting that goes on tomorrow?
It's hard to imagine that in-person voting could be held tomorrow and have any kind of a valid outcome in the election. In 2016, over 2 million votes were cast in the presidential primary in Wisconsin, and right now, even if everybody does return the absentee ballots that have been requested, only about a little over 1 million people would have cast ballots, and people are not going to show up at polling locations. And I'm even worried that because Wisconsin has really restrictive rules about mail-in voting, you have to get somebody to witness your ballot before you mail it in, and people are at home, and people who are living alone, they're isolating themselves for their own safety and for the safety of others. They're isolating themselves in their own homes, and yet they get this ballot in the mail, and they're supposed to find somebody to witness it and sign and sign this, saying that they have indeed done this the right way. So I think there are going to be even the mail-in ballots that are
Yeah,
going to be invalidated in
yeah,
many cases, and so we're not just talking about huge numbers of people effectively disenfranchised in the state's largest city in Milwaukee. And there will be a lot of people who would have voted but won't if we go ahead with this election tomorrow.
yeah.
But it's all over the state. In some of the rural communities, they don't have any poll workers willing to work in polling locations. They can't really do in-person voting because they can't staff their polling places.
Obviously, there's something wrong with our voting system, right? Even before COVID, we were having so many issues from California to Texas, all long lines, the machines were an issue. So there's obviously a lot wrong with our elections. How do you feel in general regarding what we should do? And then added to that now with COVID-19, how do you feel like the rest of the primary should proceed?
Wisconsin, at one time in our history, industry, was really a pioneer when it came to opening up voting to more people and encouraging voter turnout. Wisconsin created election day registration where people who weren't registered to vote could actually register on election day. They could walk up that day, register to vote, and then get a ballot and cast a ballot. We had election laws in this state that really encouraged participation. And in very recent years, we've gone in the exact opposite direction, as have many states around the country. We put in place an incredibly restrictive voter ID requirement. I already mentioned that that there's this crazy restriction on mail-in voting, where even if you are a senior citizen living alone, uh, and you may not have a driver's license, so it may not be easy for you to get a voter ID
Yeah.
to share with election officials. But then you're also supposed to get a witness.
Yeah.
And in the midst of a pandemic, for people who are isolated in their own homes and they live alone, that's a huge barrier right there as well. So many things have been done in recent years to suppress the vote, and you call it what it is. These efforts are voter suppression, pure and simple. And I think the games that are being played with this spring election is also all about holding down the turnout. It is about
Yep.
voter suppression.
Yep. Yeah, it seems like the establishment wants to wrap up the election as quickly as possible. So most people don't really pay attention as much as we progressives do when it comes to issues like wages, rent control, etc. This is what the progressive movement has been all about. However, because of what's happening with COVID and the, mediocre response from our government, it seems like more and more people are rising up and are, doing rent strikes, doing like labor strikes. What do you see? What's the good that you see coming out of that could possibly help us like fix our election system, maybe like get more people involved in the political process?
Well, for me, people simply have to push like crazy, fight like crazy, to open the process back up. We should have a system that is welcoming to mail-in voting, that makes registering to me people should be automatically registered to vote as soon as they turn 18. We have the technology, the data is out there, and it's readily available to government officials for people. We should automatically be registered to vote at age 18. And that's not a hoop you should have to jump through. We could have automatic voter registration in this country, and every state should be pushing in that direction. But it should be a national movement eventually. And then we should simply provide as many different avenues for voters to participate the way that makes most sense to the voter. We should have those options available to them. And for some people, they may be leery of mail-in voting, and Wisconsin has not had a good mail-in voting system. And here we are in the midst of a pandemic, and we have no choice really but to rely heavily on mail-in voting, but we don't have a good system for it. So local election officials are in a horrible position of being able to get all those mailed-in ballots counted in a timely fashion.
Yeah.
So there's so much about our system that needs to be looked at and revised, but it should be done in a way that makes voting as accessible to people and as workable for people in their own situations. But even then, when you think about voting on Tuesdays, that has a history that dates all the way back to when this was really an agrarian society. Most people were living on the land, and Tuesdays were chosen because they didn't want to have it on a Sabbath, and they wanted to give people time to be able to travel into a local community from the hinterlands.
Wow.
And so Tuesday got chosen. In
Didn't
today's
know that.
society, when most people don't live on farms, I was born and raised on a farm here in Wisconsin, but most people don't live out in the country. It makes absolutely no sense to hold an election on a work day, during the work week. We should be looking at weekend voting. We should be looking at multi-day voting. We should be looking at automatic voter registration. we should be looking at creating election laws that create the most opportunity to participate that's possible. And instead, we have elected officials who are trying to suppress the vote.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening actually. And I just want to ask you, because you did run for governor, you are somebody that ran under a progressive platform. When you ran as a governor in Wisconsin, how was the treatment regarding the Wisconsin electorate? Like, how did you feel that they treated you versus like your supporters say?
Well, the reaction I got from regular voters was terrific. But the treatment by the political establishment, by party leaders, I got the full Bernie treatment. They threw up every obstacle possible. They denied our campaign access to voter lists and party member lists.
Wow.
They threw every obstacle in our way possible, and we tried to power through all of that, and ran a campaign where I traveled over 100,000 miles in Wisconsin over the course of 11 months, reaching out to voters. 100,000 miles without once ever leaving the borders of our state. That took me to every nook and cranny of our state. It was an amazing experience and a real blessing to be able to connect with regular people that way. But there's no question that the treatment that I got from the party establishment and from the party bosses was very, very different. And like I said, it was the full Bernie treatment.
Yeah.
And that's obviously discouraging. It's just something that all of us have to try to think of creative ways to get around. It's a sad reality in our political world right now.
Yeah. And it seems to be getting worse. I think we're seeing the division between the establishment and the people. It's not even about just progressives. It's like the working people. There's obviously movements rising up. I know that Wisconsin is obviously going to be the place where we have the convention, which will now take place in August. As of right now, Milwaukee in particular. How are you guys prepping for that? How is the state in general actually like prepping for that? Do you have any information regarding that?
I think everything is on hold. There's been talk about pushing it back to August. There's also been talk about how it might need to be a virtual convention.
Ugh,
I think with the
jeez.
pandemic, so much is now in a state of flux. And
Yeah.
as a result, the planning of events like that has just ground to a halt. Now that is both understandable on the one hand, because we are in the midst of a pandemic and people are practicing social isolation, but it's also incredibly dangerous. It's also really troubling, because it creates an opportunity for the political establishment to sort of do this in a way that limits participation, and that puts restrictions on people who want to be part of this process. The mess we've got on our hands with our presidential primary and our all of our spring elections here in Wisconsin, you can see this extending out for several months, and we've just all got to push like crazy to have the voice of regular people heard at every step of the way, because there are so many opportunities that are springing up for those insiders to sort of push the public aside and to work their will in kind of an internal power game, with the public kind of iced out of the equation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what it seems like. This is, I mean, everybody's taking this seriously, but there's also that whole opportunity that they have to pretty much say, okay, now it's going to be a virtual convention and we're just going to get this done. So just on that note, I want to finish up by asking you, what is your opinion on the election so far and how it's gone? It does seem to me personally, the way it's been handled hasn't been the best. It's been troublesome, as we said before. But what do you think of the Democratic Party's circumstances? Now, it seems like Bernie Sanders has a narrow path to victory. There are still many states to go to vote, but Joe Biden hasn't even been present when it comes to this whole pandemic. He's been becoming less and less relevant in people's minds. And it seems like Donald Trump has the upper hand in the general with the way things are shaping up.
Well, the thing that's so curious to me is there are still 27 primaries and caucuses yet to be held.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody is even close to having the number of delegates needed to secure the nomination on the Democratic side.
Yep.
And with 27 primaries and caucuses still to be held, there's this narrative out there that's being pushed by mainstream media and being pushed by party insiders that the race is over, that the nomination has effectively been decided. And the curious thing is that it wasn't too many weeks ago when Bernie Sanders was sort of reaping a whole bunch of delegates in those early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and New Mexico. And people were saying Biden's done for.
Yeah.
He's dead in the water. And then you have Super Tuesday on March 3rd, and suddenly the whole narrative shifts, and they said the race is over, it's all decided, we've got our nominee, and everybody's just got to climb on board and back that nominee. And people forget that there are 27 primaries and caucuses that have not been held. It's an immensely frustrating process for me, where so many Americans are told that the outcome is a foregone conclusion before they ever have an opportunity to participate and cast their ballots.
Yeah.
We should have a system where Americans actually get to vote before all the political pundits and the party establishment types tell people what the outcome is.
Yeah. It just makes their vote seem like it doesn't matter. And that's how we felt in California in 2016. By the time we voted, they had already called everything for Hillary. And of course, there were so many issues. And I just, it's unfortunate because the Democratic Party seems keen on selecting Joe Biden rather than letting the people decide. And, we can argue about the ways Bernie Sanders has lost people, but we can also look at how there was so much voter suppression and the elections and how they were conducted as well, and how this isn't a fair shake. I mean, we're not having a fair election. And so it just seems like we're fighting against a very rigged game, so to speak. The whole system, it's set up.
In Wisconsin, there are 12 names on the ballot for the presidential primary. And I happen to be a Bernie Sanders supporter. And I have made no secret of the fact that I'm backing Bernie in this race. But I talk to people all the time who maybe were Amy Klobuchar supporters, or they liked Pete Buttigieg, or and there are 12 names on the ballot for the Wisconsin primary, which was supposed to be held tomorrow. And of those 12 names, 10 of the candidates have dropped out of the race, and with 2 remaining, the political pundits and the party bosses say that really the nomination is sewn up. The race has been decided, that there's this one candidate who is the obvious and presumptive nominee. So what's happened in Wisconsin is, where you saw early polling being done by Marquette University, which is the poll that probably gets the most attention here in Wisconsin, and Sanders was leading in Wisconsin. And now you see Biden surging into lead, basically because the message has gone out there so clearly that the race is over, that everybody might as well just hop on the Biden train because he's the presumptive nominee. So all those people who had an interest in supporting, whether it was Cory Booker or Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg or whoever it was, they were told in no uncertain terms that your vote, your support for that candidate is irrelevant, that they're out of the race, that you don't really have the choice that you thought you might have. And a whole bunch of voters, millions of voters here in Wisconsin, have basically been told that their thinking is irrelevant, that it isn't going to help decide the outcome of the Wisconsin presidential primary. That's sad. I say that not just as a Bernie Sanders supporter, but I just say that as a lifelong citizen of the state of Wisconsin. It's sad that the people in the state, so many people have effectively been told that what they thought about this race simply doesn't matter, that their views are irrelevant, that their vote is irrelevant, that all of this has been decided. That is anti-democratic in the extreme.
Absolutely. So is there anything else in Wisconsin that you'd like people to know about, or anything related to what may or may not happen in the next few hours?
Oh boy, if I knew what may or may not what's going to happen in the next coming hours, if I had a good enough crystal ball, I would say so. But things are so incredibly up in the air with these various court cases, with all of this, with election officials not at all prepared to actually handle in-person voting tomorrow, whether it happens or not. They are simply not prepared or capable of being able to handle the onslaught. So we're either going to have a real disaster on our hands if we're compelled to go forward with in-person voting, or maybe if common sense prevails, we'll get the kind of delay that makes some sense. But even then, I remain very concerned about voters who've been effectively told that it didn't matter what you thought about this presidential primary because it's over.
Yeah.
That remains something that I think is terribly sad in a country that claims to be a democracy.
Yeah. Um, where can we reach you? Where can we find you in your organization?
Well, people can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on the web at ourwisconsinrev.com. They can find me personally on social media, or contact me through the group's website, ourwisconsinrev.com. We're on Twitter at Our Wisconsin Rev. We're on Facebook. People can look us up. People can Google us. And then I just really encourage people to be in touch. This is about getting power into the hands of regular people,
Yep.
and doing everything that we can to buck the party bosses and the political establishment.
Well, thank you for your fight. We truly appreciate you. And let's hope tomorrow does not happen. Let's hope that. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good to talk with you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.